Let's begin with MSNBC's David Noriega in Tel Aviv, Israel. Also with us, our White House correspondent, Akayla Gardner, Jerusalem Journal founder and former editor-in-chief of the Jerusalem Post, Avi Meir, and global affairs journalist Elise Labott. David, all of the living hostages are now in Israel. What's the mood there on the ground, and where do things stand when it comes to phase one of this peace plan?
Ariel, the mood here in Hostage Square, I would say, has shifted subtly over the course of the last hour or so from what was for a moment very intense kind of jubilation and relief. There was a lot of cheering and shouting, a couple moments when military helicopters passed overhead carrying some of the hostages, which led to a really explosive reaction from the crowd. Now there's something definitely still joyful, but also a little bit more muted, which I attribute to some extent to exhaustion. You know, I was here a little less than 2 years ago during the first ceasefire agreement, which was just a few weeks after October 7th, and I keep comparing what's happening today to what was happening then, when the attack of October 7th, the International Criminal Court and many others have described as war crimes committed by Hamas against the civilians who were murdered and kidnapped on that day. You know, the intervening 2 years, during the intervening 2 years, it was the remaining hostages in Gaza that really kept that day alive in the lived experience of the people who gather here, sometimes every day, at least once a week. That is what kept October 7th alive in Israel. Now that that is over, that chapter is over, every living hostage is back, people, without me even asking them, are starting to talk to me about what comes next, right? What do we do now? And they're telling me about a sense of sort of heaviness and sadness that they feel now that they've also allowed themselves to feel relief. I'll play you a little bit of a conversation that I had with someone that I met here who's American, actually lives part-time in the United States and part-time here in Tel Aviv. Take a listen.
Pure gratitude. It's a mix. We know how to, in Israel, we know how to have joy and how to cry at the same time. We really see the Jewish people as a family. And how would you feel if your family member was stolen from you and in a hole for 2 years? Just so unbelievably grateful that they're, I can't really put it into words. And it's not me, it's literally every Israeli, every Jewish person around the world feels this incredible debt of gratitude. Huge gratitude to President Trump. Who in the world could have pulled this off? I'm not a political person.
Ariel, as for the agreement, phase one of the agreement, which involved the release of living hostages in exchange for Palestinian prisoners, the Israelis are now releasing those Palestinian prisoners. That process is expected to finish today. It's many more people, close to 2,000 people, who are being released on the Palestinian side. One of the groups representing the hostage families is protesting the fact that a number of the deceased Israeli hostages, their remains have not yet been returned. I think it's a little bit of a question whether that constitutes a violation of the first phase of the agreement. But really, Ariel, I know we're going to be talking for a while, so one of the things that's really important to keep in mind here is that in some ways this is the end of the story, but really in a lot of ways the story is only beginning, not just for the people here, but very much so also for the people of Gaza and for every other Palestinian living both inside Israel and in the occupied West Bank, as well as in Gaza, Ariel.
And David, just really quickly, if you can give us a sense of the condition of the Israeli hostages.
Yeah, the medical teams that are in charge of caring for them, they've been released into the care of these medical teams. They're not giving very detailed, precise information as to their condition, in part because they say privacy is a very important factor in their recovery, that they need to recover both physically and psychologically from the ordeal of the last 2 years. So we don't know a lot about, in too much detail about their physical condition. What they've told us is that they are in the process of recovery. They are in good hands, and we should be getting more detail in the coming days. Now, of course, because other hostages have been released in prior ceasefire agreements, we know that this experience was profoundly traumatic, both psychologically and physically, for the people who spent time in captivity in Gaza, Ariel.
I know you will continue to follow their conditions. And Avi, put this moment, the enormity of this moment, into context for us when it comes to the Israeli society. 738 days of collective agony now coming to a close.
Well, Ariel, if I look a little bleary-eyed, it's because I pulled an all-nighter in anticipation of this day, and also because I spent much of this day in tears, as I think have many Israelis. This is, as your correspondent said, a tremendous sense of relief. And it almost feels surreal that this is a moment that we have been praying for, that we've been desperate to see for 2 full years. Tomorrow actually marks the 2-year anniversary according to the Jewish calendar. And so to actually have this happen is just unbelievable to so many of us. And of course, that is countered and perhaps couched to some extent by the sense of grief that many families are feeling, learning that their loved ones are not going to be coming home alive, and that some of them may not come back at all. We know that at this point, Hamas is saying that they're only able to return 4 of the 28 bodies. That's 14% of the 28 bodies that they're currently holding. They claim that they can't find the rest. That is viewed by many Israelis as a significant violation of their commitments under the ceasefire agreement, and we have to see how Israel responds over the next few days.
Avi, how are Israelis reconciling this immense relief with the feeling of tepid anticipation about what comes next? Do Israelis feel that Hamas has been sufficiently incapacitated? And what are you looking for in this next phase 2?
Well, look, I think the Israeli government was pretty straightforward in what its conditions were going to be to end this war. The first, of course, was the return of those hostages. That seems to have been partially satisfied today. But other conditions included the demilitarization of the Gaza Strip and the removal of Hamas as both a governing power and as a threat to the state of Israel. Now, that, of course, has been partially achieved. We know that Hamas is not the same Hamas as it was on October 6th or 7th, but certainly the Strip itself is not demilitarized. You see Hamas militants walking around armed very openly now, basically filling the vacuum that Israel left by withdrawing to this new boundary. And so there's significant concerns in Israel about what that might look like and how we can ensure that Hamas does not reemerge as a threat, does not rearm over the next few years and pose yet another threat to the state of Israel. Now, that, of course, does sort of allude to the second stage of this. We know that there is going to be a big conference tomorrow, a summit of world leaders to talk about the future of Gaza and what the governing authority will look like. But one of the primary tasks will be to ensure that that territory is indeed demilitarized so that Hamas can never again pose a threat to the people of Israel.
So, Elise, zoom out for a moment. Given the context we just heard from Avi, after years of watching this region as you have, give us a sense of how pivotal this moment is for Israelis and Palestinians and how complicated the days ahead will look.
Well, I don't think you can really underestimate either. I mean, as you know, as both of your guests have already said, this is a moment for both sides of relief and grief. Relief for, this day, this monumentous day, the release of the hostages, the withdrawal of Israeli troops and release of some Palestinian prisoners, but also the intense grief that they've had over the past few years. So I think the region's going to be a little shell-shocked, but I do think there is a new day. Let's be honest, the war is not over. I know President Trump has said the war is over. There's still 2 more phases of the war that need to be resolved. Who's going to run Gaza? Who's going to disarm Hamas? How is that international force going to come in? And that's what President Trump is going to be doing today at this summit in Egypt, talking about the way forward. How can the region really stay engaged to make sure that Gaza is rebuilt, that the international community helps Gaza, helps the Palestinians stand up governance? There's talk about who's going to govern Gaza, but the Palestinians are really have a deficit in leadership. Mahmoud Abbas is like 20 years into a 4-year term. So the Palestinians need to rebuild themselves as well. There's going to be a lot of trepidation between the 2 sides about security and whether they can trust each other. But I think for the rest of the region, there's this just collective sigh of relief that this is not this kind of albatross hanging over the neck of the region. And I think what's happened over the last 2 years, the degradation of all of Iran's proxies, Hamas, Hezbollah, the Houthis, the attack between Israel, the U.S. and Israel on Iran has really changed the security architecture and the landscape of the region. And so I think for the rest of the region, there is a hope that Iran has been kind of defanged, if you will. But there is a concern now that Israel, is Israel the main threat? So I think the way that the U.S. stays engaged and makes sure everyone kind of keeps the eye on the ball will determine whether the region moves towards peace or not.
And speaking of that, Akela, President Trump, as we've been mentioning, is making his way to Sharm el-Sheikh with these other leaders of Arab states, Muslim nations. Palestinian President Mahmoud Abbas, who Elise mentioned is not wildly popular among his own people. And there will be European leaders present there. What message is he hoping to deliver as he engages with all these leaders?
Well, we expect his message to largely be celebratory, much like the speech that he gave earlier today to the Israeli parliament. We also expect him to talk about broader peace in the Middle East and really this normalization that the Trump administration has really pursued since President Trump's first term. But not in attendance today, even though he was invited, is Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. He is citing the Jewish holiday in Israel, therefore why he's not attending. But despite that fact, President Trump heaped praise on him today in his speech. Take a listen to what some of he had to say.
I want to express my gratitude to a man of exceptional courage and patriotism, whose partnership did so much to make this momentous day possible. You know who I'm talking about. There's only one, Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. We make the best weapons in the world, and we've got a lot of them. And we've given a lot to Israel, frankly, and you obviously used them very well. I'm proud to be the best friend that Israel has ever had, and they all say it.
President Trump also called for Netanyahu to be pardoned, who is facing alleged corruption charges. But at the same time, despite the praise, he also said he's not the easiest person to work with over the past couple of months. We know there has been some tensions between these two leaders, and it's really unclear what Netanyahu's role and influence is going to look like going forward.